Hey everyone, this is Derek Clavin and welcome back to episode 47. Now, if you're new to this channel, this is basically a free online jazz guitar course that unfolds in a logical sort of manner, so if you really want to benefit, I would go back to episode 1 and really try to watch the videos in order as best as you can. I know that they're long, but watch this video here today first since you clicked on it, and if you like it, then you can go back and watch at least the first 3 or 4 episodes, and then you can take it from there. Alright, and I'm also available for private lessons and have a lot of accompanying PDFs that go along with a lot of the videos on this channel that are available on my website and Patreon if anyone's interested. So, I lied again today, and I decided that first I wanted to share a few more thoughts that kind of have to do with what I was talking about in the last episode that I didn't really mention and I think can really help put things in perspective. I really only have like 3 main points that I want to make today, so I'm hoping that this comes out a lot shorter. I'm not going to recap my ramble from the last episode, so if you haven't seen it, maybe check it out first just so you know where I'm coming from today. Now, the first main thought that I have has to do with the relationship between vocabulary, harmony, and improvisation, and how the way that I kind of see it, it oftentimes is almost like you need the vocabulary in order to better understand the harmony in order to further improve your ears when you're going to improvise. So that might sound confusing, so let me explain. First of all, before I really get into it, I think I should point out that even though I've been saying a lot of things in these videos about how I often think it could be more about the vocabulary than the harmony, I still don't think that it's a one or the other or a black and white kind of a thing. Everything still depends on context and what I may actually feel like doing or playing in the moment. So there's still certainly situations where I might play an idea that we could say is primarily being generated through harmony. And just to give you a clear example of what I may be talking about, say I'm playing over one chord of tonality, like I'll do a F minor chord in this case. When I'm thinking about or trying to feel what I want to play over that chord in the moment, instead of my mind going to a place of thinking about some piece of vocabulary or a phrase that I know and really like and I know how to apply over that chord, instead of doing that type of thing, instead, maybe my mind will go to a place of thinking about certain combinations of triads that I've learned all of them work over that chord, each in a unique kind of way to give you a different variation or flavor of that more general tonality. So, for example, over an F minor chord, I know that there's 4 major triads that all work over a basic F minor, giving you a different variation of it, and those would be G major, A flat major, B flat major, and C major. So really only using those triads and weaving in and out of them to kind of imply this unique kind of sound over the F minor, I can have a line like this. And you might like that type of thing. Now, you could still argue that you still had to come up with a line or something that sounds good, that utilizes that, but in this type of situation, you can often just think about harmony and improvise on it and come up with some cool things, alright? So you just don't want to limit yourself when you're sort of thinking about, how your ideas could be generated. Now, having said all that, I still do believe that if your ears aren't well enough developed yet, you probably aren't genuinely going to be able to hear certain ideas when you're improvising that utilize any kind of non-basic or advanced harmonic variations of something, even if you've already learned about these different advanced harmonies and think you know what they sound like. So, for example, if you're playing a tune and then you come across just a basic dominant 7 chord, without experience, you may not actually naturally be able to hear ideas that are specifically more of like a dominant 7, sharp 11 kind of sound, or if you're playing over a major 7, maybe you're not hearing ideas that are kind of creating that more major 7 augmented kind of sound, and you're only hearing the more basic regular type of major tonality. Even if you understand the harmony or theory of these different sounds, and you think you know how to use them, the truth is, Without any real amount of listening or jazz study, you probably don't really understand these sounds as well as you may think you do. The reason why I know this is because I've transcribed my ass off, and I know the experience of having these sort of aha moments, as I call them, where when I realize what the harmonic analysis is of any phrase, basically like what's going on harmonically with the notes, it further strengthens my ear's ability to hear that specific sound, where I'm able to have a more genuinely musical understanding of it, as opposed to just learning it academically and removed from any specific sort of context. The way that it works is you start by being attracted to a phrase that you just really love the sound of. Then, because you know how to practice, you go ahead and learn the phrase. Keep in mind that unless your ears are already developed enough to be able to hear certain kinds of sounds, because I didn't say to analyze the phrase yet, we're still understanding the phrase first as something that just sounds good to us before understanding the phrase as a possible example of a certain harmony that may be utilized. Then, after you learn it and finally analyze the phrase and see what's going on, that's when the magic happens. Basically, what happens is you discover what is going on harmonically with a certain phrase, and once you know what it is, your ears are going, oh, okay, that's that sound. Okay, because I know that sound and I like that sound. Now I get what it is. And every time your ear recognizes that sound with more and more examples, you get a better understanding of it. Make sense? So, I'll give you an example now to show you what I mean. This phrase I'm about to show you originally comes from a Kurt Rosenwinkel solo transcription that I did, except I'm going to play it in a different key now, and I'm going to start it out with this whole note just so you can clearly hear the time and how it's being phrased, but it'll still generally be the same line. This line was originally put over a dominant kind of a sound, so I'm going to put this over F7, and it'll go like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? So, more or less, that's what it is. Now, initially, I could already tell that this line had an exotic sound to it, and upon examining it, I found that it was specifically utilizing a Phrygian dominant kind of tonality. So, over an F7 chord, basically it's using notes from an F Phrygian dominant scale. For those of you who are unsure, the Phrygian dominant scale is one of the modes that comes from the basic harmonic minor scale. It's the mode that is built off of the 5th degree, or we tonicize the 5th note in the scale. So F Phrygian dominant is the 5th mode in the same key as B flat harmonic minor. I don't think this is that important, really. The important thing that you want to know, I think, is that this mode is just one variation of a dominant sound that you could have, and in this context, it's being applied over the same dominant chord, F7 in this case. So, the reason why I think this is a good example is because, like I said, I could already hear the exotic harmonic flavors in this line, even before identifying what they are. And in addition, I could recognize that this was a sound that I was already somewhat familiar with just by listening to lots of music, and I could sort of pick out as this Eastern kind of a sound that I would hear different players get into sometimes. The point is, already learning to recognize the sound of any specific tonality before ever putting a label to it. And I think that this creates a deeper understanding of the sound, so that when you do finally put a label to that sound, you gain the superpowers of now actually being able to more easily hear that sound when you're actually playing, and because you now attach the harmonic or theoretical understanding to it as well, you know exactly how to use it. And again, I really think that it's mainly the phrase and the specific musical context that it may be in that really facilitates the learning, as opposed to just playing around with whatever the basic harmony is and trying to learn the sound. In this specific case, it's actually a funny example to me because we're talking about the Phrygian dominant scale. And even though the sound of this scale is still definitely used in jazz sometimes, it can often have a very specific sound, kind of like the sound of this line that I'm showing you here. And hypothetically, if I were to say something to you like, here's the Phrygian dominant scale, this is what it is, this is how you use it, now go ahead and improvise with it and try and learn the sound, you probably would have more of a chance of ending up with results that sounded more like Yngwie Malmsteen or, the whole neoclassical type of thing as opposed to the phrase that I just showed you, because if you have that scale, it's the same sound, but that has more of a specific vibe to it that you will never get if you just are thinking in your head Phrygian dominant. So, you understand? Learn your harmony from vocabulary and jazz language. I promise you it will be more efficient and fun for you. And you'll get a better idea of what kind of harmonic language is actually being used in a lot of jazz music. So, real quick, I just want to say one more thing that pertains to my first point here, and that is, when I talk about things like working on vocabulary, understand that this relates a lot to the topic of just acquiring musical material in general, at least the part that entails you actually gathering the vocabulary through things like transcription or composition and whatnot. Practicing the vocabulary is a whole other discussion. But if we're talking about the material, you got to go after the material you like, and I would never tell you that you shouldn't practice any particular piece of material, because if you're working on music, it's always going to be good in one way or another. But, a lot of people will have material that consists of things like doing these enclosure exercises or these like chromatic exercises where they practice playing these like bebop scales and adding these chromatic passing tones and these types of things and whatnot. And I've done these types of exercises myself, and there's nothing wrong with doing them. But the point I want to make here is that if you just transcribe the music that you like, assuming you have the ability to do it, and I'm always here for tutoring if you need help, that stuff will just show up in all the music that you transcribe anyway, and you're getting, I think, a better picture of it in your head because you're seeing it in a real musical application as opposed to seeing it in more of an exercise form, if that makes sense. So just be aware of this, because a lot of people talk about practicing these type of things. You got to know your enclosures and whatnot, but if you just learn the language, you're going to learn that stuff anyway, and you're actually going to learn some language too, all right? So something good to keep in mind. All right, so this brings me to the next main point that I want to make, which has to do with the idea of getting your vocabulary from the tradition versus composing your own vocabulary. You see, even if you generally agree with most of what I'm saying, you may say, well, couldn't you apply the exact same concepts pertaining to vocabulary to your own composed ideas instead of the ideas of other jazz musicians? And wouldn't that be way more authentic or truly artistic than just ripping off other people's ideas? So, as far as this goes, first of all, I would never tell you not to compose your own ideas. Compose something every day if you want to. It would still be great. And also, I recognize that everybody is different and on their own path, and you may already be someone who has listened to a ton of classic jazz music, and therefore you may have an easier time than someone else trying to compose something that sounds like jazz. The thing is, though, you can compose any kind of music or vocabulary that you want, and I would never say that it isn't legitimate. But if you're talking about playing jazz, although it can be subjective, you're generally going to have a harder time in the beginning if you just aren't that familiar with the language yet. Going back to the English language analogy for a second, this would be kind of like trying to come up with your own slang within the English language without even knowing how to speak the basic language yet. It's tricky because I think a lot of jazz musicians recognize and desire the artistic beauty of being a true original, while at the same time have an immense respect for the history, tradition, and evolution of this music. And therefore, I think a lot of us oftentimes want some sort of unique style that is some sort of a mesh between something that pushes the music forward with innovation and something that is still undeniably grounded in the tradition. Then there's people who don't care at all. They just want to be an original artist with a unique sound, and they don't care if you call the music that they play jazz or not. And that's awesome too, as long as you know that that's what you want to do. I think a good bottom line that we could agree on or agree to disagree on would be that if you don't care about whether the music that you're going to play is considered jazz or not, then you don't need to learn any vocabulary that comes from the tradition or off of records and stuff like that. If you do care about being able to authentically play music that would be considered jazz, you probably want to spend some time getting some stuff from some of your favorite jazz musicians and, learning how this music is put together and understanding the language. I've said this before, I think way back in maybe episode 5, but I think a general sort of thing that could happen is in the beginning, you're copying more and you're learning other people's language because you just don't know what you don't know. So you're just sort of discovering all the possibilities of what you could do. And then the more familiar you become, and over time, even if you were composing your own ideas all along, but if you weren't, maybe you'll start to compose your own stuff more and more as you progress, because now you just have more of a familiarity with the jazz language and how it sounds. So you don't have to necessarily go back to the records as much if you don't want to anymore to figure out basically how it works. So just be aware of this, because I think people can get caught up on this and, worry if what they're doing is original or not. But just remember, if you don't have any familiarity with the jazz language, but you understand stuff like harmony or how to improvise, you may think like, oh, I'll just play this C major line over a C major chord. But if you know nothing about jazz, how do you know that that line isn't going to come out sounding like something in the style of calypso or something like that? You know what I mean? So that's all I'll say on that. Okay, so moving along to my last main point now, I just want to address how exactly vocabulary can fit into your improvisations in a genuine way that sounds and feels natural. I mentioned in the last video how I think that some people may believe that if they just plug in different kinds of licks or pre-practiced bits of vocabulary into their improvisations throughout their solo, then it'll just come out sounding unnatural in a way where you're not even saying anything truly artistic. Instead, it just comes out sounding like you're kind of just performing tricks for people, like, look what I could do, one after another. And there's barely any actual musical cohesiveness in what they're playing. So as far as this thought goes, first I would say that whatever somebody plays really depends on the person, obviously. And because of this, I would agree that there inevitably will be some people who end up sounding like exactly what I just described. How you interpret someone's playing is subjective, but I think a more keen jazz musician can often objectively tell when somebody's playing leans more towards genuine art than just impressive craftsmanship. I think the important thing is what kind of a place is a piece of music exactly coming from when somebody plays it, and therefore we wouldn't want to just dismiss the idea of using any sort of pre-practiced licks or vocabulary as a viable approach, because it could still be done properly. Now, I'm going to be talking about this more in depth in another video coming soon, but even though I've been promoting this approach of really utilizing the vocabulary, that doesn't mean that when I'm actually taking a solo, I'm putting the majority of my focus into mainly thinking about different kinds of ideas that I've been practicing and just plugging them in. It doesn't mean that I never try to force any new ideas in either, but I'm generally trying to allow the music that I'm sincerely hearing in my head to flow out of me as best as possible without getting in my own way, which can be hard. I understand that for me, there can be a few main paradigms that my mind might fall into at any given moment to kind of like correct course my playing if I notice that something might be off in the moment. But generally, I'm trying to keep a clear head as much as possible when I'm playing, or really just being primarily guided through the spirit. The spirit is still massively important for me when it comes to my playing, and if you haven't seen my 2 videos that really cover this topic, you really should check them out. And a lot of that stuff that I talk about seems really basic and obvious or simple, but that stuff, I think really made a difference in my playing when I really tried to become more aware of it. So definitely check that stuff out if you haven't seen it. So this all still relates to vocabulary, because even though I've said that when you're actually playing, to an extent you can't necessarily control what comes out if you're just genuinely letting the music flow out of you, but if you've worked on an idea enough and spent some time with it, eventually it could possibly just start to come out naturally in a way where it's part of your music that is truly connected to your spirit. Basically, when it sounds more like a botched cut and paste job than a genuine musical statement, it's probably coming more from a place that isn't as strongly connected to the spirit. So, bottom line, you shouldn't let any fear of sounding inauthentic or unmusical persuade you away from working on any kind of deliberate, intentful vocabulary. Remember, it's all about getting things into the hands, alright? So, that's all I got for you today. We're just going to leave it there. So, if anyone has any comments or questions on any of this, just put it in the comments. I'm here to help. So, in the next episode,
hope you're ready for the next episode. Hey,
I'm just going to be talking about good jazz music to listen to, so it should be a fun one. So, that's it, and if you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you gave it a like. Consider becoming a subscriber, as well as a contributor to Patreon, where you get all the PDFs for $5 a month. And if you think anyone else would enjoy the content as well, please share it with them. And I will see you guys in episode 48.
Swinging and playing the blues. That's what we about.
I try to help you.